Hey guys, Jonah from Dropgun Samples here with a new tutorial for you. Today I wanted to do a tutorial showing you how to make transforming leads for tech and bass house using Serum. Recently, the tech bass house fusion sound has been getting really popular with artists like Matroda, Truth and Lies and Ship Wrek. Many of these artists seem to use leads that start as one sound and end as another. For lack of a better word, they transform. For this video, I'm going to break down how to make one of these transforming leads for your own track using Serum. So now, let's get into it. Before we start, let's check out that drop one more time using that lead. I created a simple MIDI for this sound by taking the bass melody and translating it into 16th notes. Now, diving into Serum, let's start with the wavetables. No specific wavetable makes the best for this lead, however, I do like to have at least one that's from the analog options and it has nice magnitude or a recognizable shape. These wavetables tend to give you a nice smooth tone and are reminiscent of the sound that tech house was originally founded on. For this example, I'm looking for a saw wave, so we're going to go with a basic MCB. Take this oscillator up an octave and let's move right into oscillator B. A good approach here is to look at this as more texture. We're complementing the basic tonality of oscillator A with something that has a little more character. In this case, you have much more freedom to choose what kind of wavetable you'd like. The pulse width modulation tables are great for adding a subtle grainy texture, while the digital tables bring a nice modern tone. And the spectral wavetables will create more high-frequency chaos. One of my favorites is this distorted bass dropper under the digital section. Now let's move down to the voicing. For a lead that transforms, it's cool to have the detuning open as the sound transpires. One trick with detuning saw waves is to keep them at 2 voices. The frequency shift between the 2 voices causes a phasing texture that adds a nice tonality to the sound. For the second oscillator, let's try a little bit more traditional detuning. Something between 4 and 6 voices will make sure that the sound is nicely detuned but not overpowering the first oscillator. Bring both of your detunes down to just above 0 to prep them for modulation. Let's leave the wavetables where they are for now and move into the envelopes. If you're just creating a sustained sound, you don't need to worry too much about the magnitude envelope, but since this sound is more of a stab, I like to create one that I can later modulate to open up and help the transformation. Let's bring the sustain all the way down. And one thing you'll notice is the negative curvature of the decay. The standard negative curvature is fine for plucks and percussive sounds, but for this sound, since it's a stab, I like to have a little more body. Let's bring that up. At this point, you can then play your sound and adjust your decay until you hear the envelope just cutting off the tail end of the sound. Before we move into the filtering and effects, I think it's time that we look at the modulator that will be transforming the sound. And for this, we're going to be looking at an LFO. The best way to conceptualize this is that the LFO is equivalent to an automation in your project. Oftentimes we use LFOs for quick movements in our sounds, however, for this sound we're going to be using it more as a long-form automated macro. With that said, you can basically create any shape you want for this LFO, however, for this example, I'm just going to keep it simple with a ramp up. Keep your mode set to off so that the LFO continues with or without MIDI, and then we're going to set the rate of the LFO to match the amount of time that the lead occurs. Looking at my lead, since it transpires over 3 beats, I'm going to set my rate to 1 bar. With that in mind, knowing that my lead only lasts for 3 beats, I'm going to make that accommodation in my LFO grid. You can use the Alt or Option key to make sure that this snaps on any point in the grid. Let's look into some of our first routings for the sound. As noted before, we could take LFO1 to the detuning of the oscillators. The modulation amount is up to your taste, however, I do prefer it to be around 12 o'clock or just past it. The next place to route the LFO is the decay of our amplitude envelope. For this stab, we won't need much modulation to get it fully open. There are plenty of other parameters to route our LFO to, however, we have to set them up, so now let's jump into our first filter. The filter tab gives you a great opportunity to add extra texture to the sound. Rather than using a typical low band or high pass filter, This style of lead allows us to experiment a little bit with filters that will add more texture, such as the filters from the flanges section. Many of these are great for adding unique texture to the sound, and they all do their own thing. For this example, let's use the negative flanger. Always make sure you check your filter routing. For this sound, let's put both oscillators through the filter. These types of filters are highly dependent on a good amount of resonance. They also require a decent amount of drive since they thin out the sound a little bit. With those in place, you can move the cutoff around to find the texture that you like. Since we're using a very texturized and sporadic filter, I don't necessarily like to look at the cutoff for modulation since it won't create a very cohesive movement. I'd rather route the LFO to the mix to control how much of the effect that I want. And while I can hear that the flange effect has been better served when the voices are not detuned, I'm actually going to take this the opposite way and make this effect go down as the sound opens up. Now that we have the filter in place with some movement, let's look at distortion. Distortion is a vital part of this sound. We have some really cool textures in here, but they're a bit thin and can use some body and some color. While there's no single perfect distortion for this kind of lead, I do find that the diodes are really good at adding a nice amount of body to a sound when it's lacking. So let's use diode 1 and kick up the drive just a bit. That's really it for distortion, so now let's move into the most important part of this sound, which is the second filter. For this filter, let's use a low pass. A 6 decibel curve doesn't seem to create enough movement, while a 24 decibel curve seems to cut off too much of the high frequencies. It's safe to go with a 12 or 18 decibel curve. Set your cutoff to around 11 o'clock and route LFO1 to that parameter. Make sure the modulation's going all the way up, and we should have a decent auto filter movement. Kick up your resonance for a more crisp texture on that movement and your drive for a little bit more saturation. You could take it one step further by routing a pluck envelope to the cutoff. Let's jump into envelope 2 and create a pluck with the sustain all the way down and the decay pretty short. Take envelope 2 up to the cutoff and take that modulation down pretty significantly. We don't want too hard of a pluck. By the time the filter opens up, the pluck movement is eliminated and it becomes more of a stab. So this is basically the core of the sound. This amount of routing gets you to a place where you can get more creative with the routing and the effects. So now let's look into some effects that can add some life to the sound. While none of these are extremely important, adding some of these could really add some flair to it. The flanger provides great movement itself with a low-medium mix. The chorus is also a great way to widen the sound. Make sure you take your low-pass filter up. The dimension expander is a great way to add depth to the sound. However, I like to make sure that it's further back in my effects chain. And finally, in the effects, the compressor is a great way to start leveling out peaks in the sound. I usually like to play the sound and adjust my threshold until I see just a little bit of gain reduction. Always give yourself a little bit of makeup gain as well. Now, obviously, you're not limited to just these parameters for your LFO. You can route them to whatever you like. Wavetable position, oscillator warping, any filter parameter, pitch, attack, flanger, chorus, EQ, reverb, anything. But let's say you want a certain parameter to come in less quick. You want a different curvature to your LFO. Rather than confusing yourself with a second LFO, we can jump right into the Matrix tab. Here's the routing for the comb filter right here. Say I want this to move a little bit slower along the curve, and I can take this curve right here and take it negative downwards. As you can see, it drags a little bit and then it falls hard. This curvature adjustment is basically implemented right into your modulation so that you don't have to create a second LFO. Now that we've created the sound and done everything that we need to do in Serum, let's look a little bit at post-processing. For processing this sound, the focus should be more on maintaining it rather than adding more to it. I kept it simple by first adding a little bit of Neutron 3 Exciter, which is a nice multi-band saturator, just to bring out some of those highs and colorize it a bit more. Next, I use the multi-band compressor from Isotope Neutron 3 to make sure that when it fully opens up, those peaks are maintained. And finally, I use FabFilter Pro Q3 to maintain those final peaks with dynamic EQing as well as roll off those highs and lows. And now let's check out this sound in context one more time. That's going to be it for this tutorial. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure to leave a like and subscribe if this helped you out. If you have any questions or suggestions about this video, leave us a comment below. And make sure you follow us on Instagram, TikTok, and Discord to stay up to date with our future releases and more producer tips. Again, thank you so much for watching. Make sure you stay healthy, and we'll see you next time.